This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, cultural astrologer and special guest Osei Kwakye joins Joey and I to talk about the story of us and our own personal fringe theory.
Woo!
So this is podcast. And this is what a Joey sounds like. That was supposed to be so this is Christmas. It was, I didn't really lean in far enough. I guess that's my bad. This is what an executive producer and Yoko Ono, Jess Vander sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess. I think I've been Yoko Ono before.
Have
Isn't
you?
that right?
I mean, you're actually like, maybe there are some similarities to Yoko Ono. I feel like you're a creative free spirit. There, you didn't break up the Beatles, so there's that. And of course, we have our returning ultra special guest and cultural astrologer, Osei Kwakye. This is what an Osei sounds like.
So wonderful to be here. I always enjoy my visits to Critical Nonsense.
God, I hope that the listeners get the same sort of like calm, like
The ASMR.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have ASMR, but I still like Osei's presence is always extremely welcome. Housekeeping. This place is spick and span. Gosh. Like
So clean.
we'll just keep it tight like a tiger. I rolled the R. Freaky Deutsch. God, my references
This is the show
are
where
just
he just
getting
just
older
talks
and
to
older.
himself.
Nothing else. And so, let's just cut to the chase. Osei, you're bringing the heat today. I know it. I don't know it, but I know it,
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot lately about narratives. We all have them. Personal narratives, family narratives, societal narratives. And in the past, year and a half, I mean, really since the COVID lockdown, I feel like there's been a lot of heavy discussion in society, in Western society, in America in particular, around our narrative, like as a collective. And we're seeing this debate in our news media. We're seeing it in literature. We're seeing it in film and television. And there's this like really interesting tension that's happening right now around the notion of who is responsible for telling, crafting, however you want to describe it, our collective sort of societal narrative. And it's creating like a ton of tension and anxiety. I mean, you turn on the news any given evening and, there's a lead story about critical race theory and how, some parents at some school board meeting like went apeshit and like got arrested because they're concerned that their children are being indoctrinated. At the same time, you're seeing like, issues of social justice like being sort of inserted into popular culture. Whether it is, a show a couple years ago like Watchmen, sort of like, bringing up the Tulsa massacre from 100 years ago. So like we're in this really interesting space where there's a lot of tension over who gets to tell the story, which story we sort of accept as true, and like what it means to sort of pass down stories to younger generations so that they can make sense of like who they are as a people. And I don't have any answers, but I do think the fundamental question that like is kind of stewing around in my head is, how do we decide who gets to sort of craft the story of us?
Whew. This is, a lot. I think we've talked a lot about here of like the difference between like experiential and narrative self at different points, because I feel like it's like a helpful moniker. And it's interesting though that discussion has often been focused on sort of our individual experiential or narrative selves, and this idea of what is the difference between a collective experiential versus narrative self? And I wonder a lot of those questions too. I think like both in the way that you are, although I would say not as eloquently or sort of clear-minded as you are, but also about, I think we're in a moment because we are reevaluating the this sort of narrative story of America and what is America and which part of that story do you want to or not want to be part of. That there's also sort of it's a moment of diminishment for the experiential version of what America is, right? In this same conversation, because I think, like you're saying, we've had some clear sort of like important and distinct moments in this conversation. I think like the 1619 project from the New York Times was like one of these moments where the creation of that project and a retelling and confrontation with sort of the like true beginnings and origin of America before it was even America, sort of like, right? Like if the beginning wasn't true of the story that you are told, then like what is? And in those moments, I think where you're sort of like, what is real, what's not, you go through those moments too, where you have the people being like, a lot of economists who are looking at like sort of the long arc of history, who are saying like, there are things that are bad right now, but it is also like safer than it's ever been, healthier than it's ever been, and not as good as it likely will be, or, like those types of discussions. And you're going through this thing of like, that was bad. We don't want to repeat that. Like, we need to adjust the way that we're telling the story of what is America so that what carries into the future can be, more fair and just and all the things that still I think many people would want to strive for in like the ideal of America versus the reality of America. But we tend to say like this, or there are people who will say like, America is trash, I'm moving somewhere else or whatever. And it's like, is that story better or different somewhere else? Or is this like always sort of the moment you go through in the writing of history, that there is this like cultural battle of what is real that is sort of just a product of contending ideologies? I don't know.
I think that's a great point, because I mean, ultimately it's a very uniquely American problem too. Because if you're looking at other, societies on the planet, I mean, many of them are sort of rooted in like a semi-unified, like shared history, shared lineage. There's like a shared sort of like anchor narrative that ties Scottish people together, that ties Australian people together. But it's just so much more fragmented with the United States. So it's like when you think about American culture and particularly like popular culture, a huge part of our sort of ongoing story is various groups or segments sort of like competing for cultural supremacy. Because when you're in charge of the ship in terms of like steering culture, then you get to at least tell that part of the story. And in some instances, you get to shape the stories that have been previously told as well. So, yeah, no, it's kind of a trippy situation that we're in right now, because, similar to the ways in which like, social media has kind of created this space of just uncertainty about what is real and what is not. I feel like we're kind of dealing with a similar issue with our sort of collective societal narrative. Like, folks, it does feel as though like there is not a firm agreement on like what the facts are anymore about even history. And it's like, it's really messing with my head, because it's like, I think back to all of those years of like, K-12 education, and like we were just taught like, oh, okay, well, yeah, this thing happened and then this thing happened. I'm like, well, did it? Is that why this happened? Do we really know? Is this some form of propaganda? And I hate that I think that, but I can't help it because of just where things are at.
Yeah, I think the way you described it as like a fight is really interesting because I actually think we're talking about a fight on three fronts. It's a fight about the present insofar as like, what do we talk about? What is taught? Like, how do we tell the story right now? And what are the things that we continue to tell and allowed to persist? But it is also a fight about the past, like the way we record and capture history, and what we keep around, right? Like written, films, art, like all of the things that like try to capture a moment and how we interpret those into the future. And then then the third front is actually the future component of like how we take on that future, where we invest money to make a change about the future, and like who gets to control the purse strings to make that change, or like who has a platform to incite that change. And it's interesting even to think about like who are the different players in charge of battling, or not in charge of battling, but like who are fighting on those fronts, because it is like all of that feuding that is like whatever the results of those little micro battles is ultimately what like the jumble of collective narrative that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that not to like, overly strategist this, and I don't know if this is or not, but I think the narrative component of what we're talking about is really important, especially in this idea, right, of like none of us can or maybe should, like I don't know whether there is sort of a morality of it, but we can't know everything about everything in history. And I feel like sometimes there is this urge from sort of a virtue signaling perspective to be like, if you don't know something, your ignorance is sort of a sin. And so, but this idea of a narrative of us, I think, is really important because stories aren't technical textbooks, right? The reason why we talk about stories is because stories are fundamentally like edited, sticky, digestible, and transmissible distillations of what's important. And so this question, when we talk about telling the story, is we're not telling the facts, right? Like stories are embellished, they're exaggerated. Hyperbole as a device exists for emphasis of important points. And that idea of like the contention between what is the true history versus what is the story that we tell ourselves, like feels like it will always be in conflict, at least as like I'm talking to you about it right now. Like I don't know how those things will ever be sort of like one-to-one aligned. Like what a story accomplishes and the reasons why we tell each other stories is very different from what like fact-based historical cataloging is, right? Like there's a reason why in like old cultures you had like a minstrel or a bard or something like that versus like the keeper of stories and histories. Like they were different figures. Like the person tasked with remembering everything versus the person tasked with like telling the stories were different, right? Like they weren't the same person.
It's so interesting. It makes me want to ask both of you, is it even like, to what extent is it a valuable or worthy exercise? Is it even good to try to pursue a true history versus the story of us? Like, is that even a worthwhile task?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Like this conversation kind of reminded me of a scholar. I think he taught at the University of Virginia, like in the 80s and 90s, and I think he has since passed away, but he had this idea. I think he was like an English and history professor. And he had this idea that there should be like a foundation of like cultural literacy that like everyone should possess.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really controversial idea at the time because basically, education has always been very like hyper local.
Mm-hmm.
And, folks in the United States are very, very sensitive about the idea of like nationalizing anything.
Federalism.
With regard to education. Yeah. So it's all about, local states and municipalities and stuff. But this professor's mindset was that when you have a country that is as diverse, ethnically, religiously, like, racially, and even like, regionally, I mean, cultural differences are pretty significant in just different parts of the United States. It's such a vast land. That his argument was that if everyone is on the same page about like a like basic set of facts and stories and cultural references, that it actually creates for like a much more like unified country. So like it's not even necessarily that everything that would go inside this sort of compendium of information would necessarily be true, but it's almost as if that this is the story that we're all agreeing to.
Yeah.
And as long as we're all on the same page about this, whether or not it's true doesn't matter.
Yeah.
We just have to kind of agree like this is our foundation.
That's the constant contention between, I don't know academically what you would call like the monoculture versus multiculturalism. Like I don't know what the opposite academically is of multiculturalism, if it would be monoculture, but that idea of sort of like a singular, larger societal culture, and we all agree, and it has like an orientation towards assimilation and adoption of a central culture, versus multiculturalism is like the extreme. And like the reality, of course, as is like always the fucking case, is like the middle is probably the best of like having some foundation that we can all agree on, and then like the other places where we can all be different and sort of embrace our own cultures and heritage and history and stories or ideas or whatever, right? But like having both sides of those things have some place. And I think to your point, right now, we're in a moment where the foundation question is one that is being evaluated. Like, what is the foundation? We're certainly, and like the history and even the values, whether or not lived out or real, are, whether or not manifested, America has been sort of a nation of I'm using air quotes right now, a multicultural nation, right? Like the idea of like, give me your poor, you're hungry, all of those things. That ideal existed, even if the sort of reality didn't meet what the ideal was. And so we always had a place for multiculturalism. And now what we're contending with is that in many ways, the ideal of what we told ourselves in the story is not being manifested in reality. And so what needs to change around those sort of central foundational building blocks in order to be able to tell a story that isn't sort of rife with internal conflict, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and all of this kind of just ladders up to, at some level, the internet will set us all free, because the reason why, or at least one of the reasons why we're kind of in this sort of cultural moment, is because it has never been easier for a broader array of people to tell their version of the story.
Right.
So you're getting a lot of people who are taking advantage of that and saying like, hey, you know what? There's a platform here. This is a story that needs to be told, or this is a perspective that needs to be shared. And I have a clever way of doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that aspect of it has been good in that there are more voices now, but I don't know. I mean, part of me would love to talk to a kid right now who is like school aged and just say like, what are you learning about like the 1920s and 1930s and like the 1960s and 70s? Like, what are they teaching you? Because you've got a lot of information like swirling around you right now. Yep. And it must be really confusing to be like 12 years old right now. like sitting in a history or a social studies class.
Yeah. It makes me think a lot too about sort of there's a fundamental issue in America with regards to how prominent race is as a concept. And so even when we're trying to contend with the idea of racial inequity, the means with which we contend with racial inequity still exist on racial terms. And so the every time there is sort of a movement and a push to confront those issues, the flatness of those concepts inevitably sort of like crunches down the texture of the sort of nuance of a collective story in a way where there is always some group that is like unhappy with the way that the story, right? There's been a lot written now, and I've seen it also from a bunch of Black scholars about like we're kind of reaching the end of what white privilege as a concept gave us. We've sort of like introduced it conceptually, and now a lot of the sort of contention is from people who are like living in like working poor communities who are white, who are like, what the fuck, my lived experience isn't great, I don't feel privileged, not understanding like this deep nuance of that conversation. And so like, because we're still flattening the ways in which we're trying to push this story forward into racial terms as a means to get outside of racial terms, like we're like doing like a little bit of the Ouroboros of like finding ourselves back where we were, and that's where you're seeing like a lot of, you know, however the mainstream media will talk about it, racial tensions or like whatever, racial unease, like continue. You feel like you're fighting the same battles over and over again because like some new term got introduced in the same way, like you brought up critical race theory, which is like not tied to the story that people are using to like return to the Nixon like Southern strategy around like, you know, fostering racial animus amongst like poor white folks, right? Where you know, like my family history is just like a long history of basically being like on the shit end of the feudalism stick, right? Like family was deported to like New France as just like, you can go to prison or you can go to New France, like welcome to Canada. And so like there, but I know, you know, a lot of like poor white folks are like, my shit's not that great. Like, why is everyone talking about this? And so you wind up in this like same story of like, well, that story doesn't seem like it's representing me. And so you're still having these like the same culture wars over and over, like you were talking about, Jess, of like, we're fighting on the past, we're fighting on the present, and we're fighting on the future. Siri's talking. Ignore her.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, you know, if I were to ever become, you know, a history teacher, I think what I would principally want to do is help my students figure out the connections between the different things that have happened in the past and the present, and then, you know, potentially inform what happens in the future. Because like I was aware of this when I was in high school, but I recently read an article that like just reminded me of the ways in which, you know, the post-World War II world was like incredibly complicated, but that we tend to learn about it and talk about it in a very simplified and flat way. So like, I don't think a lot of folks even recognize the degree to which the civil rights movement and the Cold War were like the same thing.
Yeah.
And like, once you connect those dots, it completely changes everything. It's like Martin Luther King and all of the other major civil rights leaders, the focus and the attention on them was largely because there was like a fear that they were going to sort of be like the communist sort of like, you know, splinter cell And that it was going to like just send a wave of like, communist thinking and rhetoric and practice across the country. And like that's ultimately what fueled civil rights legislation, the fear of the Soviets.
Yeah.
And like we very rarely talk about it in that context. And like without having that understanding, it's very easy to just sort of operate as if like everything that happened in the 1950s and 60s was just long overdue. And, we just finally came to our senses and we were like, yeah, you know what? Let's give people rights.
Yeah.
Like, everyone should vote.
Well, it also brings up like the issue of how so much of this conversation is a product of like intellectual privilege. When we interviewed Charles Chafin, I had a question and we weren't able to get to it, but about the idea of like so much of what he was talking about with regards to this idea of like privacy and our relationship with technology and all of these things felt in some ways like a product of intellectual privilege, right? Like it is a conversation that happens in like hallowed halls amongst people who have the power to do something about it. And so much of it, like the reality is like half of the world is below average intelligence, right? And so like if we're having these discussions that sort of naturally exist outside of people's capability of understanding, then this discussion about where the culture war is, what is our collective story, and like who's fighting on the front lines of the culture war inevitably becomes people who are sort of gifted with, an above average intelligence who can contend with the complexity of the story that you were just telling about the civil rights movement happening simultaneously with the Cold War, and that, Lyndon B. Johnson is having these discussions with civil rights leaders and, Hoover about sort of the threat to the, like all of those things require like a level of complexity, privilege of like the ability to go learn those things, like all of that. And so that part of it too is like how much of this story is important versus in terms of like the factual reality of it versus the story we tell, because the story we tell is something we share. And the reason for its simplicity is that so everyone can share in it sometimes, right? Like the idea of like people waving flags at the 4th of July or whatever is sort of like this thing of like the ability to take pride in something and not necessarily have to know the complete unabridged, 240-year history of this thing.
But I don't know. I don't know if it is just me that's like placing a value judgment, but like the first analogy I jump to is like pop music, right? Like pop music is amazing and everyone likes pop music because it's a bop and it's so good. And like there is a universality to like just Olivia Rodrigo's Good For You. You know what I mean? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? Like if we're talking about this general imbalance of like a deeply wide platform for multiculturalism, but a desperate need for this like foundational, universal plane, I don't know if there's anything wrong with that needing to be more simple. Maybe that's not in contention with what you're saying, Joey. No,
I think I'm. It agrees with what you're saying. Yeah.
But I mean, the discussion of pop music is interesting though, because like it takes me to a new thought around just media in general. And I wonder like, what is history going to look like as like an academic sort of discipline or subject area in the future when we have access to so much more media and records from, the contemporary moment. It's like we would think of the Great Depression very differently if TikTok existed during that time.
Yeah. There are more pictures in the Dust Bowl.
Yeah.
But what you were saying earlier, Osei, that I think would be like just brilliant. Like you were describing it in the context of, comparing and contrasting the civil rights movement and the Cold War. I maybe think of a department at the University of Michigan that's comparative literature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the whole point of the department is just like two disparate things, like compare and contrast these things. But like, what a cool concept of the discipline where like students are writing theses of like very disparate subject matters, but like trying to find, whatever crossover they can find. Like, maybe it's already happening. But yeah, we need to talk to a young kid in his social studies class or her social studies class.
Well, yeah, the fracturing of media does sort of fracture that like foundation of what do you share, right? Like the reason why like that singular photo of the mom looking off in the Dust Bowl with her two kids is so iconic is because there weren't many photos from the Dust Bowl, right? Like there are certainly like,
So that's the one.
thousands or tens of thousands, but today we're talking about, a million photos taken at like fucking Coachella or something like that.
Viral
right?
things, like there's still something that like sifts to the top, even if it's like for 2 days and and something new is at the top.
But like if there are, whatever, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of people are on TikTok, but like a very viral thing is getting 30 million views for a 1 minute video. Like how much of that do you remember? And so like what becomes tethered? And even when you start making references, the disconnect becomes like, oh, well, Olivia Rodrigo and whatever. And I know like Kid Cudi stans or something like that who are like equally Stanish, but like the references become different. And that disconnect, widens. The one thing I just want to ask too, before we like take it to Jess's wrap up corner, is the sort of like inherent conflict in this discussion about us in like the current moment that we're in. I think, we collectively have conversations that are happening simultaneously and are like, I think of equal merit. Like both things seem right to me, and also like in conflict of like something like a much greater conversation about transgenerational trauma, about sort of like not taking on the sins of your father or mother, or, like not sort of having that like cascade of trauma carry on over time and how to address those things and whatever. And then simultaneously, we will have this conversation about history in which we will say like, we need to take on the sins of our fathers and those things. And like both things seem true, right? Like reparations seems like a good idea to me when done in the right ways, where you're sort of trying to address like the actual traumas that were created historically and creating inequity, and also like transgenerational trauma and the ways in which we're telling people to sort of find new ways to separate from like the tragedy and issues of like the historical context and toxic masculinity and all of these other things. Like both of those things seem right to me, and also are like very much in conflict with one another. And maybe it is just as simple as like walk and chew gum. I don't know, but like it becomes harder when you're having like these big pushes simultaneously, even by the same people that are like very much in conflict. And maybe it is just like the nuance of the human experience where like nothing is ever that clean and easy.
Yeah. I mean, when things are happening in the moment, a lot of times people just don't think it's that bad. It's just normal. It isn't until you have the perspective or, culture shifts or norms and values change that you look back on something, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe like we did that, or I can't believe we allowed that thing to happen. And I think this is like part of like getting older. Like, I mean, who as an adult hasn't had like a moment of cringe, just like reminiscing something that they did in their youth. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. That was like the most ridiculous thing in the world. Or like, I am so like embarrassed about like 15-year-old me. And that thing that I used to do, or that thing I used to think was cool. So it's like, yeah, we're living in like the human experience is, it's constantly like sort of reevaluating. Like nothing we do ages well.
No.
I think that's probably the easiest way to put it. Nothing we do ages well.
No. So that brings us to a very simple, straightforward, uncomplicated, simple history of Jess's wrap-up corner.
I barely have to do anything because Osei just did it for me. Nothing we do ages well because the story of us is an amalgam of perspective, right? And we get new perspective as time moves on, pushes forward, and we keep looking around, ahead, back, and where we are now, we're like, oh God. and that is the craziest thing. I'm so excited to see if we can find ourselves a young person to talk to about the trajectory of social studies in all sorts of schools, just hearing from the children what they think. I want to talk to, I also now want to talk to like
our robust teen audience.
So
all of our teen listeners, please write in.
Just like tell us what you think and then listen to it later and regret all of it in the future. Or we can do a TikTok poll. Can you do a poll on TikTok? Oh God, I can't believe I just said that. Well, but either way, I think this may have been one of the nerdiest episodes we have had in a long time, and it has been a long time coming. Thank you so much for bringing this to our table, Osei. This is awesome.
Awesome. Thank you for thinking through it with me.
Did you guys ever watch that show? I think it was on Fox called Fringe.
No.
I remember the show you're talking about, but I don't think I ever actually saw an episode.
It was like X-Files reboot, basically, but like a sort of like mystical, like procedural show. I just thought of it as we were coming into this. I think I watched a season and it was like, it like jumped the shark in like episode 3, but it was still kind of like fun at a time when like streaming everything wasn't available to you. So I was like, sure, I'll watch this. It's on demand or something like that. But it was like not good, like in any capacity. No hate to any of the showrunners. Obviously they're listening. But I've been thinking a lot about the fringes of things recently. I don't know. I think it's like a month ago now. I came across this tweet with a video. The tweet was from @Grescoe, GRESCOE. We'll put it in the show notes. But it just said, Siri, show me the most vivid conceivable example of experimental archaeology at work. And it was a group of, 20 to 30 people like parading a like large model of one of the Easter Island heads down this path, like showing how they had like 3 ropes and 20 to 30 people, and they could just get it like walking side by side forward. And it's like a giant concrete replica of a Easter Island statue, just showing like, maybe this is how they move those Easter Island statues. And I was like, oh, this is like a cool video. I like bookmarked it for myself, being like, that's fun. Maybe I'll want to go back and look at that at some point to share with someone. I was like, oh, I'm going to look at the comments. Like, what are people saying about this? Are archaeologists in here being like, yes, like this is what's happening? And I like came across someone in the comments who was just like very aggressively anti-experimental archaeology, or at least this experiment, because they're like deeply into Easter Island and the history of it and the size and scale of. And I was like, who is this person? And I'm like, why are they commenting so much? And I like went to their individual page, and it's just like they are like deeply embedded at like trying to refute like contemporary archaeological work based on their own opinions, and they seem like very well read and like very fringe in their ideas about archaeology. And I was like, is there a fringe for everything? And I think there might be. And so I wanted to ask y'all, what is the weirdest fringe thing that you have personally encountered?
This is such a rich topic. Like, I'm inclined to say, like, yes, I do believe there is a fringe thing of everything, but I'm just completely drawing a blank. Like, I don't know what I've encountered recently that feels super fringy, because I think at some level, I've just accepted that everything is fringe. So maybe things just don't surprise me as much. I don't know.
Oh man, Jose, just dropping bombs. Nothing is fringe because everything is fringe. Whoa!
Okay, all right, okay. Can we do a test case?
Yeah.
A fringe that I have not yet been able to uncover, but am desperate to make happen, is a fringe about meat glue.
Meat glue?
Okay.
Meat glue?
Have you ever thought a little bit hard at all even about how sandwich meat exists? Because
Actually I think I have.
Because when you're like, wait, that's not a turkey, right? Like that's not a turkey because there's no bones in there. But why is it kind of shaped like a turkey? Like, what is that? And when you when you look into scientific articles, they're like, oh, it's this thing called transglutaminase, and it's basically a protein binder, colloquially, literally no other way to describe it but for meat glue, that fuses proteins together. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Like, this is like taking this is like pulling back the veil on lunch meat. And like, I don't even know what opinion I would hope for this fringe to have on this matter. Maybe like some problem with it. But I just, like, I kind of wish someone would be talking about it at least.
Yeah.
So I'm not alone.
Yeah. I mean, my theory is like, if anyone cares deeply about a thing, if you've ever met someone who cares deeply about anything, there is a fringe that exists about that thing. That is like my current working theory, is that everything has a fringe, and it's just based on like, have you ever met someone who cares about something? Yes. The flowchart immediately goes to a fringe exists.
But like, okay. I guess I'm just wondering in this context, for instance, like, could someone be interested? Could a fringe exist if the only people who care deeply about the subject are like scientists, as opposed to, like a mass population of
a layperson,
right? 14 lay people who are who are devoted to this. Well,
we'll see. My question is actually tied to that. Does a fringe need more than one person?
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Interesting.
Because like at some level, it's like you can be really into meat glue, but is meat glue a fringe-worthy topic until you meet the other person that is also into meat glue?
Yes.
Because then at that point, you can have a dialogue. You can establish a forum. You can establish like norms about like, hey, this is how we talk about meat glue.
Rituals,
we don't use this term, we use that term. Like,
well, this is bringing like the idea that like fringe is, and maybe this was obvious all along and I just wasn't thinking about it this way, but like fringe is basically like, are you 2 standard deviations away from the norm potentially, right? Like, are you outside like the, in quotes, normal curve of like where most people fall on a subject? And so like Jess is in a fringe because on meat glue, because she like researched meat glue and like knows all about this, and certainly like fewer than, whatever 2% of people probably have done that.
Wait, but then what you're saying, Joey, is the other side of what Osei's saying, which is it's greater than 2, but no greater than some
2%.
number. 2%. 2% of, and then it's like, oh, that's not fringe anymore. Like everyone's interested in meat glue, so it's not even interesting.
What's interesting though, too, if you follow this like normal curve example, is that every fringe has a countervailing opposite.
Oh.
Wait, like a counterculture? What do you mean?
Yeah. So just for the sake of this argument, the meat glue lovers exist, then the meat glue haters have to exist, right? Two standard deviations within meat glue
Either
opinions. Like the middle is just no one gives a shit about meat glue. But then if you have people on one end being like meat glue is the worst, you have by sheer demonstration of their existence, they are proving the existence of the meat glue lovers.
So
Wow.
a fringe has to have a take, is what you're saying. It's gotta be, you have a stance. If you're a fringe, you love something or you hate something, or you think something's good or you think something's bad. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like fringiness has it has a direction to it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a trajectory or velocity to fringiness. Yeah. Even on like some great like measurable gradient of like positive or negative sentiment, right? Like even that tells you there's sort of like some directionality to it. But I think what's also interesting is that there's sort of a moral component to fringiness, and you could be in a fringe that is deemed morally acceptable, right? So like the opposite of a flat earther is potentially like the extreme round earther, which may still
Round earther.
may still exist within like the gradient of acceptability. They're just like pursuing it so strongly. Like they're so pro science, but science is acceptable. And so like that fringe is still within sort of acceptance, but like the flat earthers are sort of on the opposite end of the fringe.
Can you imagine the opposite is like, it's not just round, but it is a perfect sphere.
Yes.
And they're like super intense about it. And they're like, yeah, we agree with you. I know, but I need you to agree more.
Yeah. I need you to truly accept this in your heart. And by the way, your heart is also a perfect sphere.
But can we clarify?
That's where they jump the shark.
These fringes are not always warring factions. Like, just because there could be the opposing fringe doesn't mean that it must exist or that it hasn't reached mass. For example, everybody loves Costco, but I am a part of this Costco lovers group on Facebook, and it's one of the few reasons I even am ever on Facebook anymore, and I delight in it so much. But I don't think they're not existing to try to prove Costco haters wrong. They exist just because they have a direction of loving Costco does not mean that is the only reason that this fringe persists. It's because they want to share in the pride of their membership.
Yeah, I think they can exist independent of one another and have no relationship with one another potentially. And also, like, I now know if this theory holds, if the existence of one fringe inherently demonstrates the existence of the opposite fringe, that I could go to Facebook right now and find a Costco haters group. And it may not be like equivalent or whatever, but like it means theoretically that like if there's a lover's version of something, there's a hater's version, which is sort of like the most generic dulled down of this fringe thing. But like, right, like in the same way of like this like anti-archeology, like not having its third eye open, like group of people that exist, it means that there is like the ultra adherent, like proselytizer archaeologists that exist.
So is evangelism a core component of fringe?
Oh, because you're trying to expand. So must a fringe in its directionality need to expand?
I don't think evangelism has to be there.
Okay.
But I think there's like a relationship probably.
Ooh, actually,
probably a strong correlation.
Wait, or is it one of two options? Is it evangelism or protectionism, where you don't want it to expand because you believe that there is a certain caliber of fringe member that would actually be diluted if there were fringe expansion?
Yeah. The one thing I want to say is, like, I don't inherently think fringes are bad, right? Like, historically, like, so many breakthroughs socially, culturally, scientifically, whatever, come from the fringes in one direction or another, right? Like, we were joking before the show started, like, heliocentrism was a fringe belief because everyone believed the Earth was the center of the universe. And then at some point, like, that fringiness, like, pushed hard enough and had some maybe evangelism, to your point, and ultimately became things. So, like, I don't think fringes are inherently bad. And also, it feels like we're just seeing so many more fringes, maybe because of the internet. Maybe this is like an entirely not interesting and novel thought. I'm just like, the idea that if a fringe exists, a countervailing fringe also exists has, like, broken my mind in this conversation. So
it's very like quantum fringe.
Yeah, quantum fringe.
Yeah,
that exists.
Newtonian fringe.
Yeah. I guess that brings us to Jess's fringe corner, which I think also has, like, fabric fringe in addition to being about
like tassels.
Fringes. Yeah.
Or are you talking about, like, the hairstyle? Bangs?
Yeah, like, it has bangs and tassels and is very interested in out of center ideas.
I'm really excited that we have introduced a new scientific theory about cultural fringes, and it could not have happened outside the context of our cultural astrologer, Osei Kwakye. But
thank you so much.
We are here talking about fringes. I think I can't spend this wrap-up corner time any better than requesting we hear of all of the bizarre fringes to which you listeners belong. I would be so curious to know.
Yes,
like,
please.
We want to know the weirdest fringe that you're a part of, and if any of this theorizing plays true for you. So send us an email, criticalnonsense@sylvain.co.
Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Recorded, at least in my part, in, wait for it, MacGyver Studios in
She's
New York,
back.
New York. She's back, people.
As always, we like to thank executive producer and proponent of Bangs, Jess Vander.
Thanks. And I also have to thank, as always, our dear friend and cultural astrologer, Osei Kwakye. Thank you so much for joining us, Osei.
Oh, thank you guys so much for having me.
We'd also like to thank
sound engineer Alex Contel. I just broke my bit. See, I'm supposed to do that part, but now I'm doing it. So I'm special thanks to Alex and special sorry to Joey for breaking my bit.
We also like to thank designer Nora Mestrich for just not, fighting the fringe, just embracing it and making everything wonderful.
And so much more than a 2% standard deviation of the mean. Am I doing that right? No. Our production help, Sorry Gilbert, Les Jacobs, and Tony Vong. Thanks so much. Especially shout outs to Les Jacobs, programmer extraordinaire. We have to give him some kind of extra special thanks.
Special shouts to Les. And as always, thanks, Ellen.
Thank you.
Special apologies to any mathematicians we insulted in the making of this episode.
Or scientists, or those
statisticians,
in the sandwich meat industry.
Astrologers, if you're offended, sorry. Special thanks to laparoscopic surgery. It's kind of cool. Like, thanks for whoever was on the fringe with the idea that, like, I'm just going to stick some sticks in somebody and handle this surgery from the outside. It's kind of gross in there. Don't want to get my hands in it.
It is kind of a wild idea when you think about it, though.
Yeah. I'm going to do this surgery from the outside.
And completely out of nowhere, I'd also like to thank limes. Lemons get a ton of credit, but I don't know if limes get enough credit.
For real. Occasionally, I'll squeeze a lime on something and then, be doing other food prep. and like touch my mouth a little bit. And I'm like, limes are delightful. Like I'm so delighted that I accidentally limed myself. No one's ever upset by that.
See, I have a theory about this.
Yeah, ready for it.
I think it's because of just the cultural supremacy of lemonade stands.
Really?
Yeah.
But
I think like lemonade stands are just so embedded in like Americana that like as a result, like we're always talking about lemons and lemonade. But like limeade is a delicious drink too.
So good.
But limes are not as generous with their juices because they're little.
They are.
And they're not as juicy. They're a little bit drier, so maybe that's why they're just getting all this shade.
It depends on the particular cultivar. Also, how does the saying work? When life gives you limes.
Fuck yeah. Well, see you next week. Okay, ready?
10 minutes? Can we do it in 10 minutes?
I think so.
Great.
Yeah, famous last words.
Nope, we're doing it.